All right. First, we're going to start with Mr. St. James.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keito St. James, and I want to talk about, like the historical perspective on everything. Um, I'm actually a Kyle descendant, Claiborne Kyle descendant. The family's been here since Kyle, before Kyle. They're actually from Mountain City, and um, I wasn't raised in Kyle. I was actually raised in Hawaii, in California, and I heard a lot about Kyle. My great grandmother had been paying taxes in Kyle since 1901, and they've actually paid taxes straight through forever. A lot of their land came in the 1860s and 1870s, and they talk about Mountain City. They talk about some families living in Buda. And on a historical level, first of all, what we know as the police department was actually created during the days of slavery, and it was actually the institution was set up to control the slave and non-white population. And so a lot of times, a lot of the implicit bias system, the system of slavery, and the prejudice was built into actually controlling the population. During the Jim Crow eras, again, it was to make sure that there was the colored part of town and the white part of town. Everything was separate colored bathrooms and so forth like that. And so a lot of times the police were set there to make sure that everybody stayed in their place. So a lot of times, sometimes the biases are set up hundreds of years before we know that, before we even know, because it's just assumed that, if you're not in your place, and you're not doing what you say, someone can call on you and say, hey, this person's, they went to the wrong water fountain or something like that, And this is over 100 years. Slavery ended, Juneteenth, right? From the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. My great-grandmother was born in 1886, and her parents were born in the 1850s. They were actually, I guess my great-great-grandparents would be born in the 1850s, and they were here. They were here in Kyle, they were here in Mountain City, they were here in Buda. And just to see their history, that I heard about when I was living in Hawaii, and then to come and see it myself, And so their history, and I always compare it to a lot of the Latino population, where there's like two Kyles. There's all the main Kyle and all the different Hispanic restaurants and Hispanic grocery stores. So it's two separate worlds working at the same time, and people really didn't see. So I'm sure that there at the time there was an African American world working too. So people really didn't relate because they all live in different parts, different worlds. I did have the pleasure of coming to the old Kyle and going to the old city capitol, the city hall, which was a little house over there. And they knew my great-grandmother by name because she had been paying her taxes. Can you imagine a person paying taxes for 100 years? She inherited the land, bought the land from her mother, and then in turn she paid the taxes from the 30s all the way until the 90s, And so it's very historical. And but at the same time, we also had some dark history too. Like I have my great-great-grandmother's son was hung in the hanging tree, And so we have this history about being hung. And so when you are a population that has been either prejudiced against or controlled, people have a certain attitude how they perceive things, They don't react very fast. They react slow. They make sure that they're not making big waves in the system, And these are the systems that they built in to survive, My family actually did very well. My great grandmother, her husband, who was actually from Mountain City, also his family They moved to Austin in 1903, and they started a movie theater company. First, he was a worker, and then eventually they opened a movie theater in Austin. But yet they still came home and say, "Where's grandmother? Oh, she's in Kyle, Texas again. What's she doing there?" You know, and even in the 90s, Kyle was the country. I mean, you come here, it was just the one center street, you know. And I think I remember seeing the Bonton. It was very, very, you know. But the history is definitely, you know, the implicit racism that the people had to endure was there. You know, we told stories and people functioned on a certain level. My whole thing is to definitely, you know, I was talking to someone in the library and they're like, "Oh, there's people of color, there's black folks from Kyle. There's no library book that tells about it." So we've basically been whitewashed out of history. So one thing about the family is to come back and say that, hey, we really existed. We really were here. So a lot of times I may make comments like that and show up at the chicken dinner and go, "Hey, we're one of the people that's from here," you know, because we've been written out of history. We're completely whitewashed, you know. And it's important for the community to say, "Hey, we want to know about these people of color, these African Americans who are from Kyle. You know, they do have a history." I mean, we call the cemetery the Pioneer Cemetery because we were the pioneers. We're the ones who cut the logs, built the house, cut the trees. It wasn't, you know, slavery for the Kyle community was not big old plantation like you see in the South. It was just a pioneer family. And I always see it kind of like a pond. There was the family who was pretty much the white family, and there was the black family, and it was like a mirror image of the community. You know, everything that create what is Texas, the people did. And when you talk to a lot of the relatives, they tell you the stories like that, you know. And but you know, in the history, we do have a history of someone being hung in the hanging tree, hanged. We have a history of some of the males, because in a society which is a dominant white society, you can't have African American males running around taking over the town. So for some reason they get pushed out some way. So there's history of them, as you know, in the Jim Crow laws, in the days of Jim Crow. You know, if you didn't have a job or you looked like you were doing something that wasn't right, boom, you'd go to jail for minor infractions. And so we do know of some of the men going to jail for a year, for 6 months, for 2 months. You know, we hear about that. You know, but that definitely is a history that needs to be told in Kyle. You know, the cemeteries and the community. You know, and it all really does affect what's going on now, because it's people who even assume that everything was good when there was things happening. We in our family, especially with the pioneers, we don't say the slave cemetery because it was people who were enslaved. We use the enslaved people, the people who survived the Holocaust of slavery. You know, and we think that our families are the survivors. They survived the Holocaust of this 250 years of enslavement. They survived it. They're the survivors, not just the people who were enslaved and their descendants.
Thank you, Mr. St. James. We appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you.